A dusty street in Jericho at mid-morning, heat rising from packed earth and the smell of baked barley and sheep fat hanging in the air. Voices formed a low wall of sound, sandals scuffing, coins clinking, children calling out to vendors, and women shading their eyes with linen. In the crowd, a solitary figure moved like a small island of motion, quick and precise, his breaths short, his eyes always scanning for advantage and escape. People turned away as he passed, not from fear, but from old habits of scorn. Why would anyone look twice at a man everyone called a traitor and a thief? Yet that morning, a single gaze cut across the tide of judgment and landed on him with a weight that no ledger could contain. Why him, the town asked? Why call the publican whose coins had become his reputation? The answer would not be a verdict, but a revelation of grace. Stay with this scene, because what looks like a simple raising of a voice will become a portrait of mercy that could change how you see your own offenses. Zacchaeus had been small since childhood, a fact his peers had turned into 1,000 small cruelties. As a boy, he remembered standing on a low wall to see games he could not join, tasting figs stolen from a neighbor's tree while pretending not to. His father, once a proud man named Eliab, had taught him the rules of counting and bargaining, and had frowned when Zacchaeus showed an uncanny skill for persuading the reluctant to part with coin. At 12, he apprenticed with a distant cousin who collected tolls, learning how to read routes and timetables of merchants, how to spot when a caravan would flinch. By 20, he had honed methods that multiplied the household coin and yet thinned the townsfolk's trust. The formation of his skill was practical and cold. He loved the rhythm of numbers, the comfort of a ledger balanced, the small satisfaction of a calculation solved. But that practical mind became a shield that hid an ache. Childhood taunts hardened into a hunger for approval that only gold could seem to purchase. Crisis came when neighbors like Miriam and Yosef began to cross the street to avoid him, when a peddler named Hanan hissed that Zacchaeus had taken more than the law allowed, and when a woman called Lydia spat accusations he could not legally refute. He inherited a profession that the community loathed and a name that marked him. Presently he was known by his title more than as a son or husband. He owned a small house by the eastern gate, a chest of coins, and a loneliness that hollowed his evenings. He prayed in the way his forebears had taught, but his prayers often sounded like bargains. He wanted to be chosen, to be seen, but he feared what being seen would demand of him. As Zacchaeus accumulated wealth, he also accumulated walls. Built schedules of avoidance, routes through alleys, quick glances at city guards to know which way the crowd leaned. He dressed plainly, but he kept a ledger locked in his chest beneath a rug. At markets, he negotiated with a smile that never reached his eyes. The cold calculus that had made him efficient in tax collection made others call him greedy and corrupt. Men and women who once bartered grain with his family now barred their doors. Among those reactions were Simon the potter, who rebuked him at the gate, Joanna the midwife, who looked away with a tightened jaw, Bartholomew the innkeeper, who refused him wine, Nathan the young scribe, who muttered curses under his breath, and Tobias the coppersmith, who threw down a coin rather than accept his payment. The price of his ascent was social exile. Nights were the worst. When lamps winked behind curtains, he walked the streets to count his gains by the moon and felt emptier with each sum. He would stand under the fig tree and listen to distant laughter he could not join. His hunger for respect had cost him respect. He had all the trappings of success, yet none of the warmth that made a house a home. The town saw only the publican. They did not see the man who rehearsed apologies in the dark and practiced the tone of contrition he never meant to use. Rumors spread through alleys like incense smoke. Word grew that a teacher from Nazareth was passing through, a man whose name carried both reverence and consternation, a man who healed and who upset the apple carts of comfortable piety. Some said this teacher was a prophet, others said he was a troublemaker. In the market, people argued that he must be a judge or a king. "He calls sinners home," whispered Miriam along with a dozen others, "or he makes them confess under the sun." The expectation among the crowd was justice or spectacle. Far from being soft, the public at times craved a public correction, a voice that would expose hypocrisy and restore what they believed to be moral order. Conversations crackled. "Maybe he will lecture the taxmen," said Simon the potter. "Maybe he will drive out the worst of them," muttered Joanna. Gossip often named Zacchaeus as a likely target of rebuke. The prophet's approach became the subject of bets and sharp tongues. Yet the rumor carried an undercurrent of curiosity, too. Who would he call? Who would he choose to sit beside him at the table? Beneath the clatter of speculation, a quieter question began to form. Who does grace choose when everyone else points fingers? Zacchaeus heard some of the talk from open windows or through the hum of the market, and with a mixture of dread and desire, he wanted to see. The crowd tightened as Jesus entered the city, and Zacchaeus' first impulse was to slip away into the maze of byways that protected his privacy. Then he changed his mind. He would not meet this man in the center, where stones and stones' words could crush him. He would find a vantage where he could both hide and watch. That choice felt small and reckless at once. He darted ahead, feet whispering over cobbles, heart thudding. He saw the teacher with a group of followers, and the sight of genuine attention, not bargaining glances, struck him. In a movement that was part childlike curiosity and part triggered instinct, he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree near the road, balancing on a limb and peering over leaves that smelled of bark and dust. The urgency of the decision trembled in him like a confession not yet spoken. The tree scene became electric with exchanges and senses. Leaves rustled under his palms, and the sun filtered through branches, warming the leather of his sandals. Below him, the crowd murmured like an encircling sea. Jesus paused, and his voice cut through the noise like a bell. "Zacchaeus," he called. Zacchaeus froze, fingers tightening against the rough bark. "Look up," the voice continued, calm and piercing. The air tasted of fig dust and anticipation. Zacchaeus felt a flush rise to his face in spite of the breeze. "I must come to your house today," Jesus said. The crowd pushed, and a chorus rose. "How can he choose him?" someone shouted. "Why would he go to a sinner's home?" another asked. The exchange became a small courtroom of emotion. Zacchaeus' internal voice answered in halting phrases. "How does he know my name?" he whispered. "How does he see me through the ledger and streets?" The dialogue between the teacher and the town unfolded in quick breaths. "Come down," said a disciple who had followed Jesus. "You will miss him if you stay up there." "But he is a publican," replied another. "People will spread shame." The tension zipped through the crowd like the snap of a reed. "Come down," Jesus said again, with an insistence that felt like both command and invitation. Zacchaeus climbed down slowly, the rough bark under his hands and dust in his hair, and when he stood face to face with the teacher, the town held its breath, as if waiting for thunder. Dialogue in that moment expanded into a dozen short exchanges, where each line carried weight. "Sir," Zacchaeus managed, throat dry, "I will give half my possessions to the poor." The crowd snorted. "I will restore fourfold to anyone I have defrauded." A murmur of incredulity rose. Jesus looked at him and said simply, "Today salvation has come to this house." A ripple of surprise moved through names in the crowd. Miriam, who had spat earlier, Simon the potter, Joanna the midwife, Bartholomew the innkeeper, Nathan the scribe, Tobias the coppersmith, and an older woman called Eunice who had been watching from the lane. "He calls a sinner his friend?" someone hissed. "Does he not know our law?" another asked. Zacchaeus felt the fragile thing inside him, the thing he had tried to buy with coins, lift when Jesus used that word that had no market price. The teacher's gaze was steady, not measuring coin, but counting courage. The sensory details braided through the conversation. The teacher's robe smelled faintly of oil and dust and smoke from his midday bread. Zacchaeus' palms were sweaty and left dark smudges on the rough trunk. Sunshine pooled on faces, making eyes narrow into questions, and windows catch the glint of gold coins in belts and pouches. Birds above sang as if timing the moment. The dialogue did not end quickly. "Are you sure?" said one of the followers. "Yes," Jesus replied. "Stay, and let grace be seen." That exchange unwrapped pride and gave an opening for repentance that was more than words. At roughly 1/3 into this telling, pause here to reflect and join the conversation. If the weight of judgment or the sting of being misunderstood presses on your chest, you are not alone. We often carry stories we hope others will not open, histories we have kept folded tight like worn garments. Tell us in the comments a time when you lowered your defenses and were surprised by kindness. Begin your sentence with "when I," and keep it simple so that others can read and relate. Your testimony may be the very thread that untangles someone else. Sharing helps build a community where shame is not the final word. I will read through and share a selection of stories in a future episode to encourage others. Now, return to the story, because what follows shows not just a promise, but a practical turning that touched a whole neighborhood. The house scene moved from private to public with the collision of ritual and restoration. Zacchaeus' home was small, the walls whitewashed and smelling faintly of oil and cumin, a table low with simple bowls. People leaned at the doorway, voices a low mixture of outrage and wonder. At the table, Jesus sat like a light dropping into a dark room. The meal became a stage of dialogue, of 8 full exchanges, intimate and exposed. "Sit," Jesus said to Zacchaeus. "Will you be comfortable?" asked Zacchaeus with a nervous laugh. "We came to eat," one of the disciples protested, "not to be judged." "Who sent you here?" a neighbor demanded. "I came because I was called," Jesus answered. "Called by whom?" said Joanna from the threshold. "Called by the Father who sees the hidden," Jesus replied softly. "Is it right to be welcomed into the home of one who takes from the poor?" asked Simon the potter with suspicion. "It is right to be welcomed by those willing to change," answered Jesus. Zacchaeus leaned forward and with a voice that cracked confessed, "I will restore what I have taken. Fourfold I will return." The air tasted suddenly like warm bread and the salt of tears. "Then your heart shows a true repentance," said the teacher. "Today, something begins that will ripple beyond your house." The disciples exchanged looks of confusion and hope. The sensory detail in that meal was rich and layered. The clatter of bowls and the smell of roasted lamb mingled with the metallic tang of coins resting in a cloth on a bench. Fingers brushed bread, and then eyes brushed the teacher, and every movement felt weighted with consequence. There were moments of tension in the days that followed that demanded full description. First, when Zacchaeus announced his intention to make restitution in public, a crowd gathered and voices rose as if to drown the plan. Someone threatened to reveal hidden ledgers, and others called for legal action. The scene held 500 or so characters of compressed anxiety. Men like Bartholomew clashed with Nathan the scribe at the gate, accusing each other of being soft or naive. Zacchaeus stood in the center, pulse loud, and said, "I will give the measure of my hand." The air trembled between disbelief and a hunger for justice. Second, a formal act of restitution called for a procedure and witnesses, and the town elders debated whether such acts could erase institutional distrust. The procedure required a public declaration, a recounting of amounts, and a binding promise in front of named witnesses. The process had the legal feel of a small tribunal and the moral urgency of a family reconciling. Third, in a private confrontation, a woman whose livelihood had been damaged came face to face with Zacchaeus and spat accusation and pain. He listened and did not argue, but instead placed coins into her hands and promised to rebuild what was lost. The space between accusation and action became holy in its discomfort. When discussing practical matters of restitution, there were technical steps that the community needed to take. First, a public declaration was recorded in the presence of 3 witnesses to ensure accountability. Then, a tally was made of suspected excess extortions using ledgers presented and checked against market receipts with a simple cross-reference. Finally, a pledge was made for repayment terms with clear signatures and a witness oath so the community might hold the payer to his word. This process aimed to restore trust in ways that were transparent and verifiable, so that repentance was not only private, but also public and enforceable. Restitution unfolded in concrete visits and household repairs. Zacchaeus walked from door to door. He knocked on Miriam's cottage and handed over silver and promised to bring back her trade tools. He found Hanan the peddler and replaced his broken cart. He sat with Lydia and agreed to pay her grain losses. His actions named people by name and mended livelihoods with coin and sweat. Neighbors like Eunice watched him set stones in a collapsed wall and asked for no thanks. "You are changing," Bartholomew said one evening as they tied ropes for a new awning. "I hope so," Zacchaeus replied, with a humility he had not known before. These scenes were small dialogues of healing, each with their own sensory notes. The smell of wet earth when he planted a new fence post, the scrape of a tool, the warmth of bread he shared as apology, and the softening of jaws that had been tight for years. The town's reaction was complex. Some, like Nathan the scribe, grudgingly accepted the change but warned against forgetting old wrongs. Others, like Joanna, forgave and helped lead market stalls again. The community began to stitch itself back together. The epilogue of this story required time to show the depth of transformation and its effect on the community. At 1 month, the immediate tides had shifted. Zacchaeus now walked with a different posture. He continued his visits and small repairs. He was still called by his old title in the street, yet more people nodded rather than turn away. The house that once smelled only of oil now had the scent of fresh bread some mornings because he had begun to host a small table for travelers and for those who needed a hot meal. The local market saw new patterns as former victims returned and traded fairly. A new rhythm had emerged where restitution was paired with listening. The month after showed a tentative repair of trust. Children who once shied from his shadow now played near his doorway. The town conversation had shifted from gossip to curiosity. Some still doubted his sincerity, but more than a few had begun to believe the change was not a show. At 3 months, ripples became visible in practice. Zacchaeus implemented a small system to receive complaints and to mediate disputes. He opened a ledger for community oversight and invited 3 elders to review his accounts. The practice of transparency encouraged merchants to bring disputes for resolution rather than for revenge. The market regained customers, and a few of the younger boys who once idealized quick gain chose honest work instead. People like Simon the potter and Bartholomew the innkeeper began to speak publicly about restoration and how an act of mercy can reshape rules of commerce and community. The teacher's visit was now a reference point for sermons and for small gatherings. The term salvation had moved from a theological idea to a lived reality in the neighborhood. The town recorded fewer complaints and more reconciliations. The social ledger had shifted. At 6 months, the transformation had matured into structures. Zacchaeus was not unmarked by his past, but he had been reoriented by a consistent life of restitution and service. He had established a small fund for market repairs and for families who could not repay losses. People named him less as the publican who cheated and more as a man who helped rebuild a fallen wall. Relationships that were once brittle now bore fruit of shared work. The market had a new covenant among traders, inspired by the restoration they witnessed. The teacher's line that salvation had come to his house was now quoted. Luke 19:5, and the phrase that repentance is more than sorrow had become a local proverb. Zacchaeus visited schools and told his story to boys who looked at numbers with hungry eyes and cautioned them against using skill to shield the heart. The community found that mercy had a contagious quality, and that when one household changed, the neighborhood itself breathed easier. What began as an awkward choice to climb a tree ended in a chain of reparative actions that reshaped a street and taught a town how to hold both justice and mercy. The arc was a movement downward in pride, then an upward in restoration. The lesson for any listener is simple and sharp. Grace often chooses the one the world would reject and gives him a new name, not earned by coin but by change. If this story touched you, consider sharing it. If you carry a ledger of wrongs, small or large, name one step you can take today toward restoration. Share the video so another heart may be nudged toward action. Subscribe if you want more narratives where mercy meets daily life and practical restitution. Remember that forgiveness is an invitation, not to forget, but to heal. Today could be the day salvation comes to a house you thought forever closed. Baja rapido, because today I want to stay at your house.